I see we're starting to let folks in, so welcome everyone. We're super excited for this conversation. We're just going to give everyone a minute or two to join. While we do, and before we introduce ourselves, would love to hear from everyone in the chat too about maybe I guess two topics. One, where you're joining from, where in the world you're joining from, and then if there's any kind of one burning question that you have that you hope you'll get out of this, would love to see that in the chat as well. And we'll get started in a minute.
And as we're waiting, remind me, where are you again, Craig?
I am in Connecticut, in the suburbs of New York City these days. Yeah, I know last time we chatted, I was in SF. Um, but we're back on the East Coast.
Got it.
Um, and you're still in Utah, right?
Yep, I'm in Utah.
Nice.
Let's see, we got a Florida person so far. We'll see what else we get.
LA. All right. Anybody international? All right.
There we go, South Africa. We got an international.
There we go.
Oh, we got a few Canadians. I guess that's international. It's all North America.
Yeah.
Got one in Paris this week, normally New York. There we go.
All right. Lagos, Munich. All right. Um, Amazing. Well, we're at 2 minutes past, and I see the attendance is growing and the comments are growing. So I think, one, just wanted to thank everyone so much for joining. We're super excited for this conversation. And as we go into it, one, we hope this will be interactive. We're going to leave lots of time for Q&A at the end, but in the meantime, feel free to drop any comments in the chat, and we'll be tracking that as we go. We'll try and answer all the relevant questions as we go along. And also, like as I mentioned, leave plenty of time at the end. First, I am thrilled to introduce Paul Barnhurst, better known as the FP&A Guy. He's a co-founder of the FP&A Hub community. He's a podcast host of multiple podcasts. I hear you have a new one coming out, Paul, and then also a leading FP&A thought leader. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Craig. I really appreciate it. And yes, we're rebranding FP&A tomorrow, coming in October, FP&A Locked, and we're doing a special series on kind of AI and modeling because there's
All
just so
right.
much noise in that space right now. So,
All right, and definitely topics I'm sure we'll chat about today. And for everyone joining, my name is Craig Thompson. I work on the finance and go-to-market teams at Aleph. We're an FP&A software company that provides a single source of truth for financial and operational data, really connective tissue for finance teams across Excel, G Sheets, Word, PowerPoint, Google Slides, Slack teams, you name it. I think that's a lot of our focus. And we just announced our Series B last week. So it's been a really fun time. I've been on the team for 2 years, and with that, I think the goal is still to be very kind of general focus here. So even though like I work at one of the players in the space, we're going to keep it broad. We're going to keep it kind of like broadly applicable to everyone. And I want to kick it off, Paul. Man, on the one hand, we've seen entire industries rise from carving workflows out of Excel. We've seen this with CRMs. We've seen it with cap table management like Salesforce and Carta. And yet, for FP&A teams, spreadsheets are still dominant. They're still here. Why is that?
so I think a lot of that has to do with the flexibility, right? If you think about a cap table, how many different ways can you do it versus how many different ways can you forecast revenue, right? A cap table is a list of names. Percentages, yes, it can get complex and there can be dilution, but it's a different level in my mind of complexity. And then CRM, the reality is CRM is database data primarily, right? Your reporting was never probably ideally for Excel. But when it comes to modeling and flexibility, as I always tell people, if you choose to go with any type of tool that has a database, you're giving up some flexibility for that. And Excel is the ultimate flexible tool as a standalone tool. It's great even with, all the benefits that can come with it, but its flexibility is unbeatable. Spreadsheets in general. I think that's one of the biggest reasons. What about
Yeah.
you?
Um, Man, it's just it's amazing to see. I'm in the, you know, Excel never dies for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. And one of the things that is really interesting to me though is we've seen, the spreadsheet market share has changed over time. So there was like, Lotus 1, 2, 3, and then there was Excel. Now there's Excel and G Sheets definitely like has a role to play. I'm sure you've messed around a little bit with like Shortcut and some of these other kind of like
Mhm.
AI spreadsheets. Do you any strong opinions about any of those tools?
I mean, so I think there's some that are doing great things. I think they have unique things, and there's cases where they are better to use than Excel or Google Sheets. Won't say financial modeling is that use case. I think there's one that does some marketing stuff really good. I think there's one that handles big data and security better than any of the others out there, but they just have a very hard road to hoe in the sense of how do you carve out and compete with an 800-pound gorilla?
Yeah.
And Microsoft does a lot of great things. I'm not taking anything away from Excel. It's a fabulous tool. But, you would want innovation from each of these because that keeps Microsoft on its toes.
Yeah. So then my provocative question would be, in terms of, yeah, look at the results. So we asked the poll of
Shocker, 92%.
I think, Paul, we've joked in the past about this. There's two types of finance professionals. There's those who use Excel and liars. And I see that we have a lot of honesty here today.
Well, it's
Uh,
kind of like I say, right? You can't be an FP&A professional and use a Mac because you need the
yeah,
real version of Excel. Get
yeah,
myself in trouble with that one, but same idea.
yeah. So then the provocative question I'll ask is, if you think out 10 years and you think about utilization for finance teams of, I'll say, Excel plus Google Sheets. So I'm going to exclude Shortcut. I'm going to exclude some of these other like spreadsheet interfaces, just those two. Will utilization of those tools for core finance workflows be higher, lower, or the same than it is today?
If we're talking standalone, without like I know Aleph, you guys add a database and you do some things. It's not just Excel. If we're saying standalone, I think it will be lower. If we're
Yep.
talking about all the different tools that have said, hey, we're going to build on top of Excel, probably pretty close to where it is today. It might be a little lower. I mean, I definitely think there will be some inroads, but again, we're guessing 10 years out. There could be something that
Yep.
leapfrogs all this. But if I had to guess, I'm not sure we'll see a huge change. I think we'll see a decrease, but I'm not sure how material it will be.
Yeah, I think that's probably my guess would be like a very popular answer, and I probably agree, but I'll be I'll my hot take is that it's going to be higher in the future, not even the same, even higher. And I think yeah, and I'll define this as like there is a spreadsheet used somewhere at like some point in the process, and I think it will be used at more points in more processes. And a big part of this is we're trained on how to use Excel and G Sheets and the spreadsheet interface from middle school. And so there's just like a huge advantage to having general tools that everyone grows up, having some familiarity with. And increasingly, I'll speak for myself, it's how I think. And it's how when I was like in my, Goldman Sachs analyst training, we spent 10 weeks doing like only Excel based modeling before we even started the job. And so it's like you're trained on like all these things that you're going to learn. This is like the interface for how you think. So all of that means it's just a beloved, like the spreadsheet interface, the columns and rows and the grid is just beloved.
Yep.
And so then I
No
think about
question.
like why isn't it used today? Like what are the places, like what are the friction points? I think there's like, man, error prone, typos, fat finger mistakes, lack of trust of like you inputting information. It's tough to kind of like take what you did in the past and roll it forward over time. And to be honest, I think the first thing AI is already really good at today. And the second thing is like a well-defined problem that I think AI is actually increasingly getting pretty good at. And so for me, I see a tremendous potential in tools and AI improving the spreadsheet experience as opposed to replacing the spreadsheet experience.
Well, I mean, I think something that's important to remember is I think the spreadsheet numbers will be similar, if not higher, in 10 years. I'm just not sure it's all going to be Excel and Google Sheets, right? Whether you use Excel, whether you use a totally different tool, there's still 95% of those tools are giving you a spreadsheet experience. Some are
Yeah.
choosing to use multidimensional modeling and some natural language to write them, but it's still at its core in many ways a spreadsheet experience. And it's because that interface is
Yeah.
super friendly. And Excel has so many built-in advantages that, yeah, I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. No question.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like a core question on everyone's minds and why we're even like having this conversation is what AI means for the finance space, what it means for the spreadsheet, what it means for modeling, and even what it means for, corporate budgets. And so I guess like Paul transitioning a little bit, one of the questions is really like it used to be that, everyone like even like 6, 12 months ago, people were increasingly starting to have an AI budget. And now we're trying to, see it be more applied and more specific. Have you heard anything from, kind of like companies you worked with, how they're thinking about like bringing in AI tools, where they're looking, anything that's going to help productivity?
Yeah, I mean, I saw a report that says most today are still using the LLMs. I think everybody's trying to figure out what tools do I bring in. I saw a number, and I'm sure it's higher because this was a few months ago, that said something like, was it I can't even remember. I think it was it was 75,000 new native AI companies in the last 2 years. And it's grown even more than that. And if you think
Yeah.
maybe 2% of those, let's just say 2% are finance related, say it's 100,000 now. That's 2,000 new companies out there. People are just, I think, a little overwhelmed of how do I make sure I'm implementing the right thing? What does it mean? Do I do it in house? Do I try to build my own agents? Everybody wants to do something. And then you have the elephant in the room. How good is your data? Because we
Hmm.
all know if you feed AI, just like if you feed a human bad data, you're not going to get good results out of it without a lot of cleaning up.
Yeah. I think it's such a fascinating topic of like there is so much hype around AI and there's so much promised potential. Then there's like realized potential of like what it can do. And then there's kind of like the places, which I think is like what a lot of these companies are doing, is really trying to figure out like we know that it does this one thing well. How applicable is that for
Yep.
finance? And so if I try to break that into kind of like AI data preparation, AI data cleaning, AI analysis, and AI outputs. Across that spectrum, are there any places where you're seeing kind of like particular either like promise or particular like overhype?
I'm seeing a lot of promise in the analysis space with some overhype.
Yeah.
You see people, hey, I saw somebody advertising DCF model, pay an analyst $400, pay a consultant $900, pay us $1.20. And I'm kind of like, yeah, you still have to review all that work. You're not going to get everything. I haven't seen models that are getting everything perfect in a way that I can just turn over to a client. So I'm like, kind of pump the brakes a little bit. We're seeing some amazing stuff though on the modeling front. I've seen some great things with you guys, Aleph. You've shared some of the variance commentary type things you're
Yeah.
seeing in analysis, charts. So we're definitely seeing a lot there. I'm getting ready to see a platform that's all done a lot of AI work on the data side that I'm excited to see. So we're definitely seeing a lot of different things, but the one that has me most excited is probably because where I've been focusing lately is just the analysis and the amazing things that can be done inside your spreadsheet today. It really is just moving so fast compared to where it was even 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago.
Yeah. One of the, my personal kind of like topics that I spend a lot of time thinking about is really like will the workflows change or how the work gets done change with AI? And so just to show two examples, I think there's kind of like one approach to AI for analysis, which is you tell the LLM, here's some data, make my budget. And then there's a second approach, which is, you know, here is my data. Here are the formulas I like to use. Here's kind of like how I think about the business logic. What are like, can you like apply this business logic to these new historical numbers? So it's much less like asking the AI to come up with your business model and much more having it process a series of like 100 small manual steps that it's deterministic, it's formulaic, but you can tell it like apply these formulas in a more deterministic way. And I think like that, at least for me, feels more like the future where the way we think about forecasting, the way we think about analysis is actually very good. The frustrating part is how long it takes to get from A to B and the risk that there is an error at some point in that chain of logic. And so for me, I think a lot of the benefit of the LLM is much more streamlining that process, reducing some of the manual work, but not changing the fundamental workflow.
I think, I'm sure there'll be a few areas where some fundamental get changed. I think for the most part, I agree with you. There will be people who will try to have it do the
Yeah.
whole process. The more experienced you are, the better you understand the process, the more you're going to go through, at least early, especially step by step. And it's going to be very much iterative, human in the loop, helping you save time and work through the process. Because, right, the budgeting process, anyone who thinks they can just, hey, do my budget is treating it like a math exercise. And if you're going to do that, what happened to the strategy formation, formulation, and the conversations? You're missing the reason we do budgeting, in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the goal of the budget is not to predict the future. It's to make good operational decision making, make good strategic decision making to create that future.
Exactly. If I always say, if I could predict the future, I would be up in the mountains somewhere hanging out fishing because I would have made a fortune at the stock market. Like one time I got my budget for a month. I had like multiple different business units and the whole thing came to within $1. And somebody's like, you're great at forecasting. No, I got lucky. Trust me. I
Yeah.
wasn't that good at forecasting on millions of dollars.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I should caveat and say, okay, so yeah, so we asked this question of, how are you allocating budget to these AI features? And I think I'm uh not surprised, but still really interested by the fact that double-digit percentage of our respondents have a dedicated AI budget as opposed to it looks like it's not just a plurality, it's a majority of expanding the existing software budget. And I bet that if we ran this poll 6 months ago, I think the dedicated AI budget and the expanded might have been flipped a little bit. But I think this resonates, I think, with a lot of what I'm seeing, which is more like we still need to run the same evaluation processes to address the same problems. But maybe where in the past we might have picked a tool that addressed, this amount of problem that required this amount of work to get it to work. Now you can, have a little bit more budget for the AI tool because it's going to do more for you, but it's still the same fundamental tool.
Yeah, and typically, these new AI tools take the ERP space as an example. There are several new native ERPs. Their implementation times tend to be 20-30% of the traditional tool. Okay, that's all savings. That's stuff you can reinvest elsewhere. And
Yeah.
so I think within existing tools, with not having to have as much of a dedicated budget, there's a lot of things that can help that money stretch further if you think smart about how you're doing these things.
Yeah, I will say we've been spending a lot of our time talking more about like what these tools are doing at scale, but the implementation point, such a relevant, such a great point of just like all of this work of getting these things linked where in the past you were working with like a professional consultant or an implementation team who really is applying a series of like if then statements in their mind about like we'll set it up this way. How do you want your chart of accounts to look? Like, what type of business are you? We recommend these. Um, And I think that, that honestly is like a kind of a neat proxy for looking at kind of how AI forward are the organizations that some of your vendors are working with, is how quickly they can do the implementations. Like it's not one to one, like there's other things that are involved there, but I do think like, yeah, to the extent that some of these like newer ERP providers are able to implement at a fraction of the time and a fraction of the cost of some of the more like legacy providers. Same thing in the FP&A space, same thing in kind of like all of these other areas of finance. I think it's really interesting.
I agree, and I think we all need to look at scale, and that's another huge area. I totally agree with you. It's very exciting, and I think the most important thing I tell people is this is human in the loop. Wherever you're using AI, right? You wouldn't take your employees' work and just give it to your boss. It's the same
Yeah.
type of thing. Use it to your advantage. If you're not using it, you're making a critical mistake. You need to use it, start pushing the limits, and it can do a lot more than you think. The analysis just keeps getting better and better by the day.
Yeah. So with that as a great transition from things keep getting better and better today, but as we zoom out and think like, how good are these tools? How good are these models? Like, how do we disentangle the promise of 6 to 12 months from now versus like what exists today? You know, what are you seeing in terms of like just sheer tool fatigue of all of these things that promise various things? And are there any themes that you see in areas where tools are structurally coming up short or overpromising and under-delivering?
Yeah, I think the biggest area I think tools are struggling, I don't think we're there yet, is multi-level reasoning agents, right? Salesforce has come out with some numbers that show theirs were really struggling. Many people saw the MIT report that said, and this was internal projects, 95% would fail. Gartner came out with a list that said 40%. The multi the multi-level reasoning is not there. The agentic workflow is really good, especially when you're able to define it clearly. It's great
Hmm.
there. So I don't think the reasoning's at the level for complex stuff. There are areas it can do, but I still think there's work to be done when there's a lot of reasoning that needs to take place. At the same time, the more you can chunk it, the more you can break apart, the better the chance you can get there. But I still think the agents aren't quite where the hype is.
Yeah,
What about
I
you?
think I agree with that, and part of it is because the end workflows are still getting built too. Like when I think about how we've developed features at Aleph, it's been a lot of like AI is very good at cleaning messy data, like and messy labeled data versus like incorrect numbers, but it's more like you have a CRM where a bunch of sales reps, with all apologies to any AEs on the call today, like there's like typos, there's like stuff in there that's different from how you would put it in an ERP. And I think AI is actually really good at cleaning and mapping that data, but that's kind of like a discrete workflow. And I think part of having a really strong agentic experience is you need a critical mass of these workflows that AI has really nailed. So whether that's on the cleaning and mapping side, whether it's on the analysis side, whether it's on like writing back to a model and having it like update an Excel model for you, there's a critical mass of like the AI needs to be really good at each of those discrete things before it's ready for an agent to sit on top and operate all of those independent workflows. And
Yeah.
I think actually like the agentic techno it's like one of those like the technology is there with enough guardrails on the underlying things, but I think all of this is still new enough that people are still mastering like what is the breadth of those workflows. And to your point, where I think I see it falling apart is people who start with the agent and then try to figure out the workflows. And you really have to start by understanding the workflows before you're ready to build the agent.
Well, right. Any technology should always start with mapping the to be the as is, mapping the entire process out, then figure out what the to be should be and where AI sticks in. If you just try to go out to an agent and start kind of putting the process in without having spent that time up front, you're going to have a problem, just like any technology, whether, planning tool, ERP, spread, whatever, treasury tool, some new spreadsheet tool, whatever. If you don't think about how it works in your processes, your data, all those type of things, you're just setting yourself up for failure. And I don't think AI is any different. It doesn't magically solve that. It may be quicker for implementation, it may be easier, it may shorten the life cycle, but you still have to do your work up front.
Yeah. And while we're on the topic of doing the work, I see there's a question in the chat that budgeting and planning season is in full
I
swing,
saw
and
that.
there's a question of, what is one most crucial piece of advice you would have for finance teams that are just now getting started?
Yeah, it's so hard to boil it down to one, but I'm going to try my best. I think the one piece of advice I would give, if I could only give one, is over communicate. Make sure you communicate all those deadlines. You have all those conversations. You have open office hours, that you're working as closely as you can with your partners. So you don't get to the end and run into the situation of, I don't recognize that number. That's not my number. That's a communication failure. If I was going to give two other pieces of advice, keep it simple for the business. Do as much as you can. Don't overcomplicate the templates. Focus on that 80/20 rule. And then the third is, when you're building your calendar, give yourself some flexibility, and also stay calm throughout it, because you're going to get a bunch of your calendar is going to get blown up. You're going to get some curveballs. It's just part of the process. So there, I gave three, but my biggest would be communication. What would your biggest be,
Um,
Craig?
Mine is, I'll just use different words to communicate basically the same thing, which is meet people where they are. I think just meet it if you approach it with the ethos of you have business partners around the organization and you're doing your best to meet them on their terms versus like forcing them to meet you on the finance
Hmm.
turf. I think that's the biggest recipe for success. And so for me to unpack that, that really means two things. First, it means making sure you understand the operational and business logic of how they make decisions. And so you aren't forcing them into your forecasting rubric. You're starting with what they know intuitively. And then it's kind of your job to translate their intuition into your model rather than forcing your model onto their intuition. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing is just like give them anchor points on which to think about the plan. I think like that's the other thing is if you try to be too bottom up and too egalitarian, you're just going to get back like a bunch of it depends. Tell me about this. Tell me about this. And so that's the one other thing I've seen that really like leads to way too many feedback loops before you get to that holistic model is not
Yep.
providing enough like anchoring guidance. Like even if it's a range, even if it's a starting point, just something that is enough for people to go on.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to add. I almost added in my first few is have those discussions and have some high level targets before you start. The worst is when they just say, just roll it all up. And then at the end, they decide what number they want. I did that in one of my last forecasts where we couldn't get an answer out of leadership. And we ended up cutting everybody's numbers by like 15%. It was just a huge mess. And they were all upset and didn't know what that meant because we couldn't get an answer out of senior leadership. And you're just setting yourself up for failure if you don't provide some of that high level guidance. Doesn't mean things won't change, but it makes your job a lot easier.
Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say before we move on to our next topic is really like figuring out what if there's any big inflection points. So I think big examples there is if you're like a physical inventory business that has factories, and there's a point where like if your forecast is to produce some number of units that force you to build a second factory. I think like those are the types of things where there's like large step function changes that are less frequent in like the software space. Although even there might be ratios where like X number of new hires triggers you need to bring on new recruiters or a new layer of middle management. Like any of
Sure.
those kind of inflection points are just always ones to keep an eye out for
Going
early.
into a new market could be a
Yeah.
software example. If you're to a specific market because of language or whatever else, you might have some big things you need to manage.
Perfect. So I think you'll see the question in the chat on kind of like tech stack and like number of tools. And I'm just curious to see how that we're seeing that proliferate. But I also, Paul, want to move on to I think is the most fascinating topic of all of this, which is the so what for all of us on the call. We now have talked about kind of like the landscape of tooling, how it's changing, where things are better, where things are still developing. What does this mean for the future of FP&A talent and culture?
I love that you said so what, because one of my favorite frameworks, and then we'll get to the answer, is the what, now what, so what framework. I don't know if you've heard that, but the idea being, right, 80% of the time we spend explaining the what. We should be spending 80 of our time on so what. Why is this important? What does it mean? Where are we going? And so that's what we're going to talk about. So the first thing that it means is hopefully, I don't think we're there yet, but we see a decrease in the amount of time that FP&A spends on data prep, right? Studies show anywhere from 40 to 70% of our time is spent on non-value add. But yet, we're supposed to be a value creation, a strategic, a front office, seat at the table function. Really hard to have that at the level you need. So that's the first thing I'm excited for. The second thing is we're going to start to see people specialize. And we're going to see companies want more and more FP&A talent, more and more soft skills, and in some ways, a little more technical. And what I mean by that, I've had this conversation with a lot of FP&A people, and they say it's going to make you have to be better at communicating, better at the soft skills, but technical in a different way. Not as much learning deeply, writing multiple ifs and nested logic and lambdas, but maybe learning a little bit of Python, a little bit of data science, type of things that allow you to take AI and go this far instead of only this far. And that's what I mean by a little bit on the technical side. And then we'll definitely see some role changes. The analyst role, I think, will change some. Will we need as many? Maybe not. You'll probably see some, like I said, dedicated if it's an FP&A architect or whatever within FP&A, because you have to understand, as you and I talked about, you have to understand the processes to build some of those applications, especially when you start getting into custom type agents and things.
Yeah. Man, this is I love talking about this. This is probably like if I think about volume of hot takes that I have on like various topics, I probably have the most
Are we
on,
getting a hot take? I'm ready for a hot take.
all
Go ahead.
right. So I'll let me tee up one and I have several. So first, when I think back to 2014, brand new first year analyst, um, I just remember 3 months of feeling so underwater, um, less confident in some of the stuff I was doing than I think like, people would expect, but also like I think everybody sort of felt that way. And then by the end of my first year as an analyst, I remember even in 2014 thinking like, man, AI is coming for my job. And I don't know when, but I'm like trying to like outrun this wave. And hot take number one is there is so much freaking low-hanging fruit in finance that we have such a massive gap before we start seeing jobs go away. It's more think about all the things that we don't do today. Like when teams do variance analysis and do flux analysis, we literally set thresholds of like below this, not interesting, above this, interesting, because people don't have time to go into every detail about what's going on in the business, but there's still probably really relevant, information there, really kind of like a lot of things that a controller probably wants to know about that's happening in the business, a lot of variance and fluctuation that FP&A teams that want to know that people just aren't looking at because they don't have time. Budgeting season. Why do we do one full budget forecast per year? And then we ride blind and do our best on a monthly basis after that. Like there is such a chasm between here and truly dynamic planning and truly like transparent drill downs into how businesses are performing that is all like relevant to the business that I just think we have such like tremendous cushion where I think we're going to start seeing teams realize how much more they can expect. And I think we're going to see that backfilled before anything else. So I think that's hot take one. Hot take two, the workflows. I think this is a little bit what you were saying. Like the workflows are the thing. The workflows are the expertise that is going to continue to matter. And if you understand at a fundamental level how your workflow should run, you have so much more of like a room for error and so much more of a gap than if you were just kind of like a rote memorization of facts. Because I think that's the one area of like if you were, think about coming out of school as like a business major and kind of like you've like memorized a lot of facts. I think that's the kind of thing that like AI actually is pretty good at. But if you can learn the workflows and understand why things happen the way that they do, I think that's something that AI can't replace. So, Paul, I
Yeah,
don't know if you have any reactions to that. I have many more that I'm happy to keep rolling out, but
I'm excited to have you go on a few more. I think on, hot take one, there definitely is low hanging fruit. I think there'll be a balance of, hey, does hiring stay the same? Right? Every company is always looking for ways for synergies. And I think reality will hit and there will be companies that will use it to find a way to either not hire more headcount or maybe reduce it a little bit. I think we've already seen that in other areas, but in looking at it holistically, I don't think jobs are going away. I'm not one of those people that think, hey, one day we're all going to sit at home and have a universal basic income. It's just not reality. Look at the internet, look at everything else. Generally, technology ultimately creates more jobs than it destroys, but it transforms things. And I don't think AI will be any different. So I think we're similar. I think there may be a little bit more on the job side than you do, but I don't think we're that far apart there.
perfect. So, hot take three, which is a little bit in conflict with what you were saying about FP&A professionals starting to like dabble a little bit
He's
more
going to
with
be in
Python,
conflict
like
with me.
starting to
This
learn a
hurts.
little bit more coding is I think that if as an FP&A professional, your domain expertise today is the workflows and how to orchestrate everything, I think you're going to be able to operate in natural language, no code interfaces where you don't need to learn any of that stuff. But I think we're going to start seeing more and more job openings for the FP&A engineer. This is going to be someone who's sort of like a light software engineer whose entire job is helping, bridge resources, bridge data from multiple sources to help create that one source of truth. And I think we are going to start finding that the connective tissue in someone who like is doing code or potentially even tools, like Aleph or like others that are like solving this problem. I think that that problem is increasingly solvable at scale. And so I think like the FP&A engineer is something that we're going to start seeing going forward in part because, for example, internally at Aleph, we had one person in particular who used to be a full-time software engineer who's now a full-time go-to-market engineer. His entire, job is basically creating automations that provide alerts and leverage for everyone on our team to help understand insights about what's going on with prospects, what's going on with potential future cost, prospects. And there's a whole lot of software engineering that goes into that, and it's a tremendous enabler for our team. And I think FP&A is going to start seeing similar roles start to pop up.
Yeah, but I think, you say FP&A engineer, I think an engineer in general, software, whatever, they know basics of coding. Yes, you could do some natural language, but I still think there's going to need to be that validation process. So you're going to need some basics. I think we differ there, which is fine. But I like this
Yep.
Q&A comment we got. We need a follow-up webinar just focused on hot takes.
Ha!
What do you say about that, Craig?
I love it. I love it. I've posted a few on LinkedIn in the past, and definitely we should do more.
Yeah, I might have to do it. Maybe you and I will have to do a collaboration, a hot take post.
That'd be fun. That'd be
That
fun.
could be kind of fun. So there you go. Thanks for the idea. We'll see if we can make that happen.
So we'll see what I think, one last poll, and then I do want to also kind of open up the floor too to kind of like general Q&A on this topic.
Yep.
So curious what everyone thinks in terms of like how AI has affected your productivity, but I do want to open it up for for any questions.
Yes, please. We'd love to get your thoughts. Nothing's off limits. We obviously will do hot takes. So, get those questions coming and answer the poll. Is that what we have now? Another poll?
Yeah.
I'm curious
Um,
to see on this one what people say. I'm going to guess. I'm going to guess 50% on number two.
ooh. Um, hey, look at that.
Ooh,
50% on the nose.
who says I can't forecast? I'm going to
Let's
Vegas
go.
tonight.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
didn't
that's
expect
that.
39% significantly. I thought that'd be a little lower. That's really good. Glad nobody said less productive.
Yes. Um,
I'd love to
yeah.
hear from some of those of what they're seeing is significantly more productive. Throw it in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm just curious to see if there's some things I haven't heard of yet because so many people are doing different things. I'm sure you get it from customers who are like, "Oh, I hadn't thought of doing that."
Yeah. So I'll while we wait for folks in the chat to answer, like my favorite internal productivity thing that we've done is we have like a chat with your data
Hmm.
feature where I can basically like I've had this happen where I want to know like some specific number. I want to pull something from, from our ERP. I want to pull something from our CRM. And I can like in our Slack ask our Slack bot, what was this thing? And that saves me from like opening up like these two different like I have to open up a spreadsheet, I have to open up the CRM, I have to go find the data point, I have to filter it. And it's just all of these little micro transactions that like would have taken me 10 minutes that now is like, 1 second of my time, plus then I can do something else, and then 8 seconds later I have my result.
Yeah, I remember you showing that to me, within
Yeah.
Slack, talking about Teams, and I think that's a great example where, is it life-saving? Is it transformational? No, not really. But does it add up to a lot of time at the end of the day? It seems like something simple. Oh, I can just ask this question here of the bot and get the answer. But as you start being able to do that within all your tools throughout the day, it adds up to a huge amount of time. One I've done recently, and I'm seeing some fascinating things, is I took an AI agent, I trained it on all my podcasts and my data. It's still in beta. I've trained it on almost 4 million words already. And it's fascinating to see the questions people ask it.
Ah,
Starting to get that insight of, okay, what are they going to ask of an agent trained on just FP&A? So that's been a kind of a fun learning experience for me.
nice. So we have a question from Alberto who asks, how can finance teams design an AI automation pilot that reliably reduces manual data prep effort without introducing new governance, audit, or reconciliation risks? Then there's questions around minimum data lineage, validation checks, human in the loop, like what are all the things that have to be in place for that to scale? I guess I can start, Alberto. So the way I'd think about, you know, designing an automation pilot that reduces manual data prep, I think the first thing is just not trying to think, how do we automate everything? And it's more, how do we start to compartmentalize? What are the specific steps? What are the specific workflows? And then kind of like one by one figure out if AI is good for that. So I think like the way I would start is if there is like, the nature of the manual data prep problem. So if the problem is pivoting data, so it might be taking, I don't know, opportunity level data from your CRM and pivoting it into cohort analysis. That's kind of like a pivot that you might have to like redo every single time. I think that's something that you don't even need like AI for. I think that there's like tools, Aleph is one, that can kind of like do that automatically for you. So you're always seeing the pivoted data. On the kind of like validation checks and lineage, the way I would think about it is AI can help automate how the check is run, but should not be the decision maker of so what with the check. It shouldn't be the one saying ignore the check or change something. It should more be flagging for a human in that case to like make a judgment call about what should you do. And so I think there's really like how much of it is a process versus how much of it is a judgment. And I think every node and every point where there's a judgment call, you kind of like really do need a human in the loop there.
Yeah. And I would say on the human, you also need to decide what's the validation level you need before you scale it, right? Start small, get that confidence level. It doesn't have to be perfect, but put some benchmarks, some goals in place versus, well, it was pretty good. And then you roll it out scale and realize it caused more problems than help. The other thing I'll say, it's really interesting when they talk about this and pilot different things. I had a fascinating conversation with the guy who's the head of modeling globally, I think for PwC or KPMG or one of them. And he's like, yeah, we're using AI in some places, and we're finding most of it helps in the early stage, not building the model, not the later stages. And one thing, and I'll get to the point that he made that I think we all have to think about, is he's like, I could use AI. We found, 68 different places across the 100. It was like 60 or 70 across the 140 different touch points they determine in a transaction around M&A and modeling where we can use AI. He goes, of many of those, what we're finding is, okay, it saves us 2 minutes here. Oh, it saves us a minute there. But here's the cost. It doesn't allow us to build a customer and doesn't allow us to bill a customer anymore. Doesn't allow us to save ahead. Why would I implement it? So I think people have to remember as well as you have to understand your business. And that's where that deep knowledge comes in your processes to say, is it worth it? Just because you can do it and just because there's some savings in time doesn't mean you should do it. And so he was talking in a lot of places where like, yeah, there are some areas we're using it and we're going to continue to look at it. But we always have to look at it and say, okay, I'm in a commodity business in this case. What AI is actually going to give me some kind of advantage that allows me to save money, win more deals, or charge less for the client? Again, which is win more deals. And it was a really interesting as he broke it all down and kind of walked through how they're thinking about it. Because I think there's a lot of lessons that we can all take away in our businesses and our finance departments of how to break it down and think about it versus just the blanket, I need AI everywhere, which I've seen some people have that philosophy. And I think you're just going to get yourself in trouble if that's your philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. Paul, two more questions in the chat. Maybe the first one I'll address to you, which is what are some best practices for budgeting and forecasting corporate overhead specifically going into 2026? And in this case, they're using Aleph, Excel, and Acumatica, approximately 115 million revenue business, wanting to maintain corporate overhead at 10% of revenue or less.
I mean, so first you have the target. I think the first thing you have to look at and say, okay, what's variable, what's fixed in your overhead, and where your investments are. Look at those different things and kind of have that plan to get there. I don't know that I think it's best to have that percentage. I think that's a general bench practice to have benchmark that and say, okay, in general, overhead should be X. Then you need to look at it and say, what does it require to get there? Of that 10% number do I need to find efficiencies? Do I need to, implement more software? What is it going to take? Like, are you at 11% today? Are you at 12? It's hard to say without knowing a little more about the business, how to approach it. But I think the question is, you need to be able to look at it and say, okay, what's all in there? What are my different percentages? What are my areas that I can keep flat as I scale? And what are the areas I have to grow? Are there some that will outstrip the overall business? And then you have to figure out how do I adjust that to stay in that percentage. So for me, I think, bucking it a little bit fixed and variable, understanding your scaling and looking at it and saying, okay, where are the areas where I have to get more efficient to stay at 10%? Where are the areas where I can just grow with the business and I'll be fine and adjust accordingly? And that's where the strategic decisions come. Once you kind of understand the different numbers, you can then decide, okay, here it makes sense to go there. Here it makes sense to implement this technology. Maybe it makes sense in the short run to go a little over, but we'll scale up and we'll be fine in the long run, right? Because headcount is never linear with your revenue. It just isn't. Ask
Yeah.
any startup, right? Right, Craig? Being in a
Ah,
startup environment, is your head count ever linear? I mean, obviously you have some numbers you want to keep and there's a general trend, but is it truly linear with revenue?
we've been doing a pretty good job of for every 10x we do on revenue, we 3x headcount.
See, yeah.
Um,
And so, yeah, you have a pretty good idea, but I'm
yeah.
sure there's a little fluctuation within that.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting on the overhead point is if there's elements of the business that do scale with revenue, right? I think like
Yep,
for
for
our
sure.
business, there is the engineering team and product, there's like the go-to-market team, and there's the customer success team, and then even like the talent team. Like all of those things have like ratios that like as we support new business, like we need to hire there. The corporate overhead though is really interesting, and so I'll make maybe agreeing with everything you said, Paul, on like the modeling and decision framework side. The one operational nugget I'll put in is I suspect that organizational benchmarks for overhead as a percentage of revenue are going to start creeping down because I think especially for this is like an AI is like an internal operational tool. I just think
Mhm.
there's so much leverage that you
I'd
can get
agree.
from those tools that I think that 10% or less or whatever the heuristic is that's in your head, I do think over time that's going to be a moving target that's going to start getting more aggressive. And so doing your best to kind of like get ahead of what that framework looks like in terms of like do we backfill roles as people leave and like how should you think about that process? I think that is one area that's kind of interesting to think
And
about.
I agree with you. I mean, right, we've heard these people say, "Hey, how big of a business can you scale with one person now with AI because of
Yeah.
efficiency gains?" And right, a one person business, there's definitely you're trying to keep it there by automating all the overhead.
Yeah. That's right. Um, one other question that got out. So yeah, and then there's a comment, yeah, for a construction business, 2025 overhead forecasted to be about 11%. Yeah, so I think we're all in that kind of like low double digits territory and trying to, make it as
8
a
to
as
12 is
streamlined as
probably
possible.
pretty common for most businesses. Some are going to be a little higher, some even get a little more efficient. I've usually heard, finance itself, finance operations are often 2 to 3%.
Yeah. And then one more question that I wanted to make sure we cover is for folks who are, just getting started thinking about how LLMs can, play a role in the FP&A process. What are some specific examples of like FP&A process points where they can point their tools? I'm happy to talk about the various areas of like how Aleph thinks about this, but before I do that, Paul, I would love to maybe like let you kick it off.
Yeah, I mean, I think a great area they can be posted at is if they have access to your data, great for variance commentary, especially if your budget's at a level where you have some of the vendors and things. Very easy for it to match all that and say, here's your variance. Or actuals to last year, very easy for it to look at it and give you a good idea. So I think the what in your variance commentary is a fabulous area. I think doing initial analysis, if you have a data set and you have no idea where to start, AI is great at just throwing it at the data set and asking for some trends. Your board deck, great to point it at that. And it's getting better where it can even sometimes build that. If you give it a good framework, it can build a lot of those decks now. There's a lot of great tools. But even if you're not doing that, what questions should I think of? How can I improve this? I mean, there's a lot of places, but I think variance commentary is great. I think analyzing data is somewhere you can throw it at. I think even helping with your board decks. And go ahead, Craig. I'm sure we could probably go for a while. I
Yeah,
think it's becoming easier and easier to find places to point it at.
I'll have many, but I'll offer up more of like a broader recommendation for anyone who's who's stuck with us through the 55 minutes we've been on so far. First, thank you. I think my broad recommendation is there are so many people thinking about these problems that are your peers. There are so many vendors trying to solve a lot of these problems. Man, if you like RFP this out on LinkedIn of like, hey, I'm like, VP of finance at this company. I want to use like LLMs in my FP&A processes. Where should I start? You're just gonna like your feed is gonna explode with people with like ideas of where to go, and then you can apply like some filters off of that. I think, it's really around if I think about this axis of trying to optimize how painful is the process for you,
Mm-hmm.
and then how good today are the models at solving that problem. I would try to like optimize for the point that's like furthest from the origin and kind of like those two axes. So I think
What's the
like
biggest pain point it's good at? There's where you want
yeah,
to start.
exactly. So I think like to give you two examples, I think like the AI forecaster, like just tell me how I'm going to do next year. I think the models are just not there at understanding the workflow well enough to do that for you. Super painful. Models are bad at it.
Yeah.
Then on the other hand, there's kind of like things that, the models are like really, really good at, like, you know, data cleaning and like mapping. I think that should be like table stakes now as like a person managing your mapping. You should just like not have to think about it and not worrying about it. But as you started getting into like, can you like what insights can you expect LLMs to surface from your data? Can you expect LLMs to know where in your Excel model or your Google Sheet model a particular driver is in a particular cell? And can the LLM edit that cell in that model for you and have that context for you? I think like this is in the now of interesting problems where like LLMs are like 80% of the way there. And
Hmm.
so if this is like a huge pain point, that starts to be like, hey, like this is interesting. Like we should chat. And if for you it's like, yeah, like that's cool, but it's not a pain point, then I wouldn't make it a priority until it's 100%.
Yeah, and I agree. The best thing always to do is to map it. And like you said, you want to, where is it good at? Where are my pain points? Whenever you can bring those together, great area to start. Because if it's good at it, you don't have as, it's not as much of a challenge to implement it. It should be easier. Versus when you're trying to implement something that, okay, it's okay at it, but it's a really big pain point. Like, well, then is it really going to save you time if it's going to fall short 5 or 6 times throughout the process?
Yeah. Um, Perfect. And with that, Paul, I think any final kind of like parting words, any last plugs for any of your many endeavors and media where people can find you?
Yeah, I'll put one more plug out there. The FP&A Hub, my community. It's another great place if you want to have conversations around AI. Lots of people are asking questions there of what they're doing, and we're seeing people answer that. So I'll throw that out there as another great resource. And then, make sure you're just keeping pushing the boundaries and thinking smartly about this, because at the end of the day, it's here. It's making our lives easier, and it's only going to continue to do that. So make sure you're taking full advantage. And I last thing I'll say is I'm excited, for Aleph, the things you guys are doing. Congratulations again on the funding raise last week. That was great news, and keep up the work you're doing because we all win together. The greater the technology and tools out there, the better for us, the consumer. So I'm rooting for you guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And with that, I put a couple links in the chat. If you want to learn more about Aleph, would love to connect and always chat, follow-up questions with anyone here on LinkedIn. Paul, thank you so much for doing this. I know you and I are both passionate about this space. It's something we're super excited about, and it's always a pleasure to get the chance to chat with you about it.
Yeah, look forward to it again, and I'm excited for our future hot takes.
Love it. All
All right.
right. Thank you all so much for joining. This call is also being recorded, so we'll send a recording out to anyone who's interested. Thank you so much again, and we'll see you on the next one.